as we go along. But I'm here to talk about the recent community stadium excavations that you can see behind me. It's been one of the more fun and rewarding 5 weeks I've had in archaeology, this project. I'm a very big fan of community archaeology and I look forward to doing more of it in the future. But let's have a look at how this dig came about. These two camps that you may have heard up at Huntington, South Moor have obviously been there for a very long time. We didn't know about them up until 2002. It was an accidental discovery when our colleague Anthony just happened to be flying over in an English heritage aircraft at the right time, looked out the window, took a quick photograph and spotted some rather clear earthworks. A bit of research in their archives revealed that the 1953 RAF survey had these previously unnoticed features very clearly showing up. You can see the outlines of a rectangular enclosure here, Camp 1, and here, Camp 2. Camp 2, unfortunately, half of that got built over by the Rydale Stadium in 1989, before PPG 16 and before we even knew it was there. However, half of it survived, and when the site looked to be redeveloped, the City of York Council decided they wanted to make a very big community archaeology project as part of this, to actively engage the public in the process. The Camp 1 site, it's mislabeled on this photograph here, so this is Camp 1 on the right, my left-hand side rather, was excavated by Yatt back in 2003. Very interesting sites, substantial prehistoric features. In particular over here there was a nice pit alignment which was Bronze Age in date, later recut as an Iron Age ditch, and the upper fills of this ditch actually featured 2nd century pottery. So we're looking at a major landscape feature. It was in the ground for a considerable amount of time, long before the Roman camps arrived. Also, within the later boundaries of the camp, you had circular enclosures, possibly Neolithic pits, possibly features related with drying corn. It looks like we've got long-term agricultural exploitation in this area before the Romans even get here. So it's certainly been in use. The camp itself was again very interesting. I think Stukely and Drake in the 18th century mentioned 7 or 8 of these temporary Roman camps to the north of York. And discovering these two effectively doubled the number that we were aware of, in addition to the 2 others at Bootham Stray that are currently scheduled ancient monuments. The Camp 1 site itself, very, very well surveyed in. Classic kind of rectangular shape with the curved corners. It was surveyed into an accuracy of within 1%, so very nicely done. However, the execution of the camp seems to have been slightly more sloppy. Some of the ditches beautifully cut, very uniform. Some of them look like they've been done in a bit of the rush by someone that wasn't particularly bothered. So there was a distinct variation in the quality of the workmanship, which may be down to separate groups of different workers with different work ethics perhaps. But we did have some really lovely classically Roman features. You'll notice 2 little dark blobs here and here. These are the traverse ditches which occupy the space immediately in front of 2 entrances to the camp. A very simple defensive technique, meaning that if you're walking along trying to attack with a big shield in front of you, you've then got to turn sideways, which makes you much more vulnerable to arrows and such. And again, a distinctive Roman feature. Camp itself, very briefly occupied. The finds material quite tightly dated to the early to the mid 2nd century, and then very deliberately abandoned. The ditches are filled in and the site is left alone, and not discovered then until 2002. Dig York Stadium project, you can see here. So here was the site before we started work. As an earthwork, you might be able to see a line coming around here that's clearly visible in the crops beyond the stadium. That part is the scheduled ancient monument, pretty well preserved. The other half of the camp sits underneath the Huntington Stadium there, which up until recently was hosting the York City Knights. The project began by our colleagues Ian and John Kenny giving a nice presentation at the Guildhall, not the Guildhall, the Mansion House. Lots of interest drummed up and a lot of people signed up to be involved with this project. We wanted to make sure that volunteers were involved with everything, not just the digging, wanted them doing the recording, the geophysics, the archive research. Everyone was recruited locally. I think Leeds and Helmsley were about as far away as it got. So it really was giving a chance for people that live in the area to get involved and get their hands dirty, as it were. But the project didn't start that auspiciously. We began by doing a geophysical survey of the pitch that you can see in the image at the bottom there, and the results weren't terribly inspiring. We were desperately trying to convince ourselves that there were some lines on this image, but there were two distinct possibilities, one more scary than the other. We knew from some geotechnical pits we had about 600 millimetres of overburden, which was the makeup for the pitch. Situation one, we couldn't see through that. Situation two, the construction of the stadium had eradicated the stadium, and I had best part of 100 people signed up and nothing for them to dig. So this was a scary time in our life. Didn't help when we surveyed the outside area of the stadium and found spectacular results in the scheduled ancient monument area just to the side of the stadium. You can see the outline of the bank and the ditch very clearly in the geophysics. You can also probably spot the deliberate mistake that that square and that square have been mixed up. But nonetheless, it showed that beyond the actual stadium structure, the camp was in very, very good condition, and we still had no clue whether it survived beneath the stadium. Before we got digging, we held a number of archive research sessions with our own Jane Rimmer, who took various groups of people into the York Explore archives and the Dig library, which is just over the road, which is a fantastic space for this. And Jane led the teams through how you can really get involved with a bit of research for yourself. The idea was to not only research our site, but to give people skills so they can go on and further their own personal studies. We consulted all that reports from previous excavations, historic maps, newspapers, photographs, everything we could lay our hands on, and found out some really nice trends of the more modern development of the area. The map regressions in particular are fantastic to see how you can see these big open fields changing, you can see railways appearing and then disappearing. And it definitely helped having local knowledge. We have a number of people from Huntington attended these sessions, and their recollections from being younger actually helped to explain some of the names of the streets and things. So that was a really, really good session that we enjoyed very much. We continued to make the outreach a big factor for the project throughout. We had open days and study sessions every Friday, so we'd open the trench up to the public. We had people on hand to show them around, show them the latest finds, and we had various study sessions looking at some of the archaeological specialisms that we're employing and to help put the site into a broader context that were all very well received. The school children you can see in the bottom corner with Jane, who was managing the fieldwork, were fantastic. We had 630 of them, being terrorised and educated by the Jorvik Group's staff as they were taught to march in formation and recreate some of the defensive functions that the camp may have had. And it was a real joy having those around, so that was an absolute pleasure. We made sure as well that we were very visible online, so that anyone from further afield could follow the dig. We were tweeting live from the trench, so every discovery was entering the public consciousness almost immediately, which was quite exciting to be involved with there. And then the big day came, the 19th of May. I was quite nervous on this day, as me and Jane got a 32-ton digger apiece, and it was quite fun, I must admit, tearing up a rugby pitch with a digger of that size. We had to be quite patient. There's various different materials in the makeup. There's the actual turf and the topsoil, there's a layer of sand and there's a layer of gravel, and it wouldn't do to just mix all those up because they're very useful materials, so we had to patiently strip off the soil, then the sand, then the gravel, stockpile them separately for recycling, and only then could we have a look beneath, and thank God, there it is. You can see quite clearly there's a beautiful darker line running along the pitch there, and as well as various field drains and plough scars and things, but it was very, very exciting moment. I remember waving my shovel around and shouting Jane and calling Ian, who's sitting at the back there. So we were very, very pleased. Plan B had been, if we had no archaeology, was to actually try and reconstruct a Roman marching camp and see how quickly we could do it, which might have been a bit niche for some people. Like, come along and dig a ditch into some horrible clay. Because this is about as nice as the clay was. It's freshly exposed and beautifully clean. It quickly got very, very compacted and dry as exposed to the air. The machining and the whole excavation process was very much assisted by a local photographer who lived about 2 minutes away from the stadium. He'd been born and bred in the area, David. using a variety of kite, mainly photography, and drone photography, but also he's adapted a 12-meter fishing pole to get some fantastic low-level images, which could give us a great bird's-eye perspective, and details that it's easy to miss. You might notice there's a bit of a curved line of white stone there. We found out that the pitch had been laid with a nice level of limestone hardcore, too much lime content in that, which had immediately killed the turf. So they'd had to strip it all off again and relay it. But what you can see there is the dumper truck's wheel ruts that must have been driving back and forth along that line, dropping off loads of hardcore. It's quite nice, not so clear when you're on the ground. So it was very, very nice indeed to get this aerial view, because it could give you a really lovely view of all the features looking straight down, and you can see very clearly we've got half of a classic playing card enclosure, and we could even see the entranceway starting to appear. Combining the aerial photography with the geophysics was a great moment. We could suddenly see the full outline of the camp and the complete different alignment to the stadium. The thicker dark line here on the geophysics is the bank rather than the ditch, and that has been completely destroyed by the construction of the stadium, so we only had the ditch to go on. But it was quite interesting to see the differences between the two plots. There's a boundary running vertically, which is clearly fairly old, because you've got post-medieval ploughing running that way in this photo, and then this way underneath the pitch. But again, I think it's images like these that were only possible because of the community involvement. Having that local skill, that local knowledge, and that local expertise involved meant that we could have these fantastic images. So we're very grateful to David for helping us out with that. And then May 25th, we got stuck in. We had 60 volunteers, all told, came and actually carried out the excavation. I can see at least one in the room now. And as always, we were very, very keen to make sure that they were involved in all aspects of the process. There's no point coming along and just doing a bit of troweling. We wanted people to actually take ownership of the features, as it were. So if you were plopped in a feature, we'd make sure that you were doing all the digging, all the recording. It was fantastic, so I barely picked up a shovel the entire time, I must say. And also we got a chance to teach people some of the more modern methods. We did some old school tape and pencil planning, but also we're doing an overall survey with the GPS as well. So again, we're trying to teach people skills they can take back to their own community groups, their own amateur excavations, and improve their methodology a little. Moving on, let's have a closer look at the actual defences. Now we have to remember when we're looking at these that we've lost at least a metre of archaeology. So the fact that these were surviving to such a depth shows they really, really were quite substantial. So we've got a classic Roman form complete with the ankle breaker that I was really hoping to find, because school kids love these. They love anything gruesome. This particular photo here, you can see you've got Russ and Chris there posing with their finished ditch lot. Imagine that ditch line continuing up for at least another metre. The geophysics on the area outside the stadium suggests the ditch is 6 or 7 metres wide. So you would have quite a drop down this slope, which all of a sudden about here gets very steep and goes to the width of about our foot. So if you were attacking, you might quite happily slide down this. Your feet could wedge in place. Your forward momentum would carry you over. You'd hear a sickening snap. And luckily for you, there's probably a chap up on the rampart that's going to come and put you out of your misery quite quickly. There's been some debate over these ankle breakers in the past, whether they're actually defensive features or whether it's just a result of people repeatedly cleaning out the bottom of the ditch to improve drainage. We did find separate drainage channels in a number of the ditches in the base. So I think the answer is probably a little bit of both, because it does make sense as a very formidable defensive feature. Digging them can be a bit of a pain. As you can imagine, digging within the confines of an ankle breaker can be quite a challenge. Ian had to adopt some quite ingenious methods to clean out the base there. But it was very, very good fun on the days when it wasn't raining. The whole camp, you're looking at 162 metres by 122 metres. We're just shy of 2 hectares with that enclosure, and the ditch has survived to up to 3.6 metres, and well over a metre deep in a lot of the ditch sections. And to characterise the ditch, we dug 8 2-metre slots through it at intervals around the site. So we really got a good section through that. And looking at the sections was quite illuminating into how the camp was used. The more eagle-eyed amongst you might spot some thin little lines here. Now these little laminations of sand and clay resultant to the ditch being open to the elements. So it's raining, there's little bits of soil and earth being washed in, and that's slowly accumulating. But there isn't a great deal of it, so it seems like it wasn't actually open for a great length of time before there's quite a sudden inundation of organic dark material like this, mixed up clay and topsoil. It seems very much the case that the ditch was open for quite a short period and then very, very deliberately backfilled. So a very similar trend to what we saw at camp number 1. The pottery that we got out of it, we didn't get much, but we got a few pieces which were very, very useful, dated us to the 2nd to the 3rd century, so a similar date to camp 1, perhaps slightly later. But that was useful to find. We'd been wondering in the beginnings whether we were looking at something which might be associated with the very foundation of York, but this put us a little bit later on. Other features, we had the entrance. You can see the big red arrow pointing out where that is on the ditch. Essentially, the entrance was quite simple. You've got a 5-metre gap in the defences. The 2 termini of the ditch can be seen being excavated in the photo there. There was no evidence of a traverse ditch or a clavicular style entrance. Now, a clavicular is kind of the shape of a collarbone. Again, it's quite a clever defensive feature that forces you to go into a bit of the bottleneck and forces you to turn sideways, thereby limiting movement and making you more vulnerable. We did find a single post hole just there, which obviously originally may have been this deep, but when we excavated it was that deep because that top metre has been truncated away. So the only evidence we might have had for a gateway was very limited, but it was nice and clear that we had an entranceway here. And you've got military treatises at the time saying that your main entrance should always face north or face the enemy, face where you're going to be marching next, and pretty much points towards Scotland, so it's on the money on that one. The south end of the trench, marked just over here, was a little bit of the mystery, and poor old Maddie here in the bottom photo spent about 2 weeks with a number of volunteers trying to figure out why this ditch section was a little bit different to the rest. There was lots of redeposited natural and slumping, which is always a nightmare for archaeologists because you think you found the base, then you find another layer of archaeology underneath it. But persistence and eventually brutal matocking won, and we found that essentially the ditch is becoming a little bit wider and a little bit more shallow at this point, which is annoyingly right on the edge of the trench. So potentially this might just be coming into the curve of a clavicular style entrance. So that'll be something that if we do get a chance to have a look at the rest of the stadium being stripped out before the redevelopment, we might be able to have a look at. We'll have to see about that one. But it was nice to get that situation resolved. Inside the camp, there are a lot of features, annoyingly, no finds that we could date them with, but there's a good chance that a lot of these are actually relating to the use of the camp. You can see Emma there just finishing the recording of a small circular feature that was about that deep, would originally have obviously been much deeper, and we were taking soil samples of these nice dark organic fills because I was really, really keen to find the cesspits. All archaeologists love a good cesspit, all the best things are in them. Unfortunately, the soil analysis from our environmental samples basically shows quite mundane activity. People are burning peat to keep warm. We've got burnt heather. It seems like just exploitation of the materials that you'd expect to find in this area in the 2nd century. Post holes, we had a few of these alongside the inner area of the ditch. You can see a nice circular feature there. Again, very truncated, so we only had the very bottom of them surviving. But with their position, there's quite a good chance this might have been the base of a timber revetment that would have supported the edge of the bank and stopped that from slipping into the ditch. So it was looking like a substantial fortification and one that was built properly. We did have evidence of earlier features as well, looking back into prehistory. Just where the red arrow is pointing in the image there, you can see that we had a cluster of features in the berm, that's the gap between the ditch and the bank. Various intercutting pits, again, very difficult to dig these, and a lot of post holes. Not much rhyme or reason to it, but the fact they were intercutting showed that we seemed to have a bit of continuous use of the ground, and a lot of them contained evidence of burning. So this seems to be pretty much underneath the bank in some parts, so seemingly completely earlier than the fortifications that the Romans laid out, so probably prehistoric archaeology. So again, it shows that people are here before the Romans arrive. We had also, you can see in this photograph here between the two archaeologists there, a linear feature which ran right through the entranceway to the camp on a completely odd alignment. There was no stratigraphic link between the Roman defences and this linear feature, and I found one piece of pottery in it that looked really prehistoric, and I was gutted to find out that it's apparently undateable. So it remains a theory, but the fact that it's on a separate alignment and doesn't seem to articulate with the Roman material at all, a good shout that we're looking at a little prehistoric boundary feature, and with the archaeology we found in the other camp back in 2003, that would fit in with the local use of the land at that time. We had later features too. Obviously the majority of this site's history, it's been farmland. So we had post-medieval plough furrows, ceramic field drains. If only every find had its purpose stamped on it, that would make it much easier. Then again, we'd probably also be out of a job. We had this little very isolated bit of brickwork as well, completely on its own in the middle of the pitch. It seems like you've got a deeper drainage feature made of 18th century brick. There's probably been some fairly shed-like cow shed or something on top of it, and unfortunately that metre of disturbance has removed all evidence of that apart from its drainage. But it was nice to see a little bit of the 18th century use of the area. And one of my favourite parts of the project was the collaboration with metal detectorists. As I'm sure some of you know, there can be quite a tense relationship between detectorists and archaeologists sometimes. But we decided that it'd be best to get everyone involved. So from day one, we had metal detectorists on site. They were very well behaved. We had them detecting, and rather than shoveling, sticking flags in the ground, it was a red flag for a ferrous response, a yellow flag for any other kind of metal. We could then survey all those finds in and show how the metal finds are distributed around the site, and also that would then inform our diggings. If we're looking through the Roman ditch, desperately trying to find some dating material, and we know there's a metal find in it, could be something quite useful. So started out very, very well behaved, and towards the end of the dig, when we'd done all our slots through the ditch, we'd taken all our slots through the plough furrows, we got the metal detectors back in, and they went around the site with archaeologists, and we investigated as many of these flags as we could. And the good thing about that is that all these finds then are from secure stratified context. So they're not just coming out as a jumble of finds. We know exactly where they're from, which means they can tell us a bit about the features that they came out of. A variety of finds, lots of bits of just the kind of standard slag and bits of lead that you might expect to find, some more exciting than others. The ring you can see on the side here caused quite an uproar as it came out of the ground, as you can imagine. I was trying to convince myself it was Roman. Remembered vaguely seeing something in an article, but I think it's more likely to be 18th or 19th century, and by the size of it, possibly a little child's ring. But nonetheless, a really adorable find. This object here is a little piece of lead, which has got scratch marks on one side and circular decoration on the other, possibly part of a lead cloth seal. Here we have one of my favourite finds, the headless horseman, which is probably from a bit of 19th century jewellery. Which was very, very cute indeed. And then probably the best one was this object here. We're still looking at this one to ascertain exactly what it is, but it does remind me very much of a Roman fibula brooch. So it would be one of the only kind of Roman personal objects we'd found from the site. So we're going to see what the specialists think about this one. And majority of these finds came out of plough scars. But when you think that this top metre of archaeology has been destroyed in 1989 when they built the stadium, it's actually very helpful this ploughing was happening, because that has moved some finds a bit deeper down to underneath that level of disturbance. So it's allowed us to find a few little bits and pieces which may well be Roman. So that was actually quite useful. And again, a very nice way to work with the metal detectorists, get them on site, and one or two have actually since then come and joined us on the Archaeology Live training excavation as well, so I think they've got the bug, which is quite nice. Another one of my favourite days on the project was when the Young Archaeologist Club invaded for a day. It was forecast to be absolutely heavy rain and howling wind, and thankfully the weather held off and we were inundated with youthful enthusiasm. So we showed them around the site, and then we set them loose to get some dating material out of our post-medieval plough furrows. And these two here were just fantastic, because they almost immediately found a coin, which I believe was Georgian in date, and then reminded the people around them for the rest of the day that they'd found a coin, which was very, very kind of them. And yes, really, really enjoyed themselves, and hopefully you've got some of the next generation of archaeologists there. It was also quite cute seeing the little ones in adult-sized PPE as well. Some of them are quite oversized. So, what have we learned? Well, we know that the camp has survived. That's the first thing, thank God. We've got evidence of the pre-Roman activity from the Neolithic periods onwards. We know the camp was only briefly occupied. We're looking at 2nd to 3rd century. And when you look at some of the historic texts, the military treatises, you've got the recommended size of your ditches being at least 5 Roman feet and 3 deep. Ours easily exceed that, so we are certainly ticking boxes there. While our ditches were much neater than the camp we excavated in 2003, there was still some variation. Some of them had this drainage channel, some didn't. So we're finding evidence that you might have had various different work gangs employed on the project. The possibility of not 1 but 2 entrances, and the lack of any substantial internal features, any stone foundations, is more evidence that we're looking at the site being occupied by tents rather than any permanent buildings. And then we have to ask ourselves, what kind of camp are we looking at finally? Classically, you're looking at 4 kinds of camps. Your marching camps, which are literally just way stations to stop on the way to another destination. Labour camps can be used to house people that are working on a construction project. Practice camps is a good way to keep the troops busy in peacetime. And temporary camps can be just essentially overspill. If your garrison is mustering for a new operation, you might have to house a few extra troops for a while. Looking at our camp, I think the latter 2 are the more likely. We occupy a low-lying piece of land. There's no strategic advantage to this place, so you could say that's evidence that we're looking at a practice camp. However, it is considerably larger and much more substantially and uniformly put together than the neighbouring Camp 1, which might suggest that we're actually looking at more of a temporary camp. And certainly the date of the pottery that we found links up nicely with Hadrian arriving in the 120s and Antoninus Pius's Scottish campaigns in the mid-2nd century. So we've certainly got a context that it could relate to. So I think in closing I must say thank you to everybody that was involved. Around 800 people are actually involved with the project altogether. All did a fantastic job in weather that was quite varied, in clay that was quite unforgiving. And I'll leave you with this thought from a Roman scholar here. And this rather wonderful image, it's the best one. It's taken just after the excavation finished, and it's the one where you can see the whole outline of the fort from above there with the earthworks in the field. And that's about that, so thank you for listening. And I'll hand over to Pete.